Hello, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Thursday the 11th of November, and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this evening I'm hosting the programme from Edinburgh. First of all, we will have today's coronavirus update, then I will introduce our guest, and then we will look at today's news headlines from Scotland and around the world together. As of 2 p.m. today, since the start of the pandemic, a total of 3,505,259 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and the UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 2,831,197 have been confirmed negative, and 674,062 have tested positive. There are 3,340 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. Of the people who have tested positive, 768 were in hospital last night, 60 of whom were in intensive care. And there are 26 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 9,358. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. The latest UK daily figures show that 142,533 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that's an increase of 195 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. And as of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,326,392 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,921,971 had received their second dose. Now, this evening, we're joined by a regular guest and contributor, Richard Thomson MP. Richard worked for a pension business, in politics, was leader of Aberdeenshire Council, was a journalist and writer, and since the 2019 general election has been the SNP MP for Gordon. Richard, good evening. How are you?
I'm very well, Andrew. When you put it like that, you make me think I've almost had a full house of unpopular occupations, and that I should maybe just get a Saturday job as a traffic warden and complete the set.
We'll have you selling photocopiers one of these days, don't you worry. But thank you for joining us this evening, Richard. Now, our first story this evening is that pressure is growing for an immediate full public inquiry into the rampant Tory sleaze and corruption scandals following yet another day of damning sleaze revelations. The calls follow reports that scandal-hit Tory MP Geoffrey Cox QC missed a number of votes in Parliament as he was on a trip thousands of miles away in Mauritius. This comes after earlier revelations that Cox took advantage of lockdown rules to vote in the Commons by proxy so that he could go to the Caribbean to work on his second job. Separate analysis published in The Guardian also revealed that he has earned at least £6 million from this second job since he entered Parliament. The Tory MP Mark Pawsey earns around £30,000 a year as chairman of a packaging lobby group, while speaking in Parliament in support of watering down environmental laws that will benefit plastic producers. The Tory MP Alan Cairns secured a second job at diagnostics firm BBI Group just before it was part of a consortium that secured a staggering £75 million of government contracts for lateral flow tests. And the senior Tory MP Ian Duncan Smith chaired a UK government task force that recommended a change in rules to benefit a multi-million-pound hand sanitizer company in which he held a second job. Commenting, the SNP MP Pete Wishart said, "It's beyond any doubt that reports of Tory sleaze and cronyism are not isolated incidents. It is a clear pattern running right through this corrupt Westminster Tory government." Boris Johnson has said that those who break the rules must be investigated and should be punished. He must now come good on his words and commit to a full public inquiry into rampant Tory sleaze and corruption at all levels, including at the very top. He continued, "Those responsible must be held to account, including the Prime Minister himself." So, Richard, firstly, we've spoken earlier this week on Scotland at 7 about how what started out as what you might call the Owen Paterson affair has rippled out into a number of different directions, rocking a number of different boats. So, do you think that these waves are reducing at all, or is this choppy water going to continue for the government through the weekend and after that?
I think it's going to continue, and I think they're in a state of absolute desperation about it. The one thing that they're absolutely petrified of is the idea of sticking, and their strategists admit this. They're petrified of the idea sticking that there's one rule for them and another rule for the rest of us, because they're red wall voters, and an awful lot of their voters in the more marginal seats in England, in the Midlands of England, in the south. They'll tolerate a lot. They'll put up with a lot, but especially if they're not convinced by Keir Starmer's Labour Party or Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party before it. They'll tolerate a lot, but the one thing that they won't put up with indefinitely is the idea that there's a venal, corrupt class at the top that's in it for themselves, with one rule for them and another rule for everybody else who's putting in a decent shift to look after themselves and their family. And that was ultimately what undid John Major's government and undid the Tories for the best part of a decade and a half politically. It was that feeling setting in his sleeves, and it's very much a feeling of that. I mean, I got involved in politics round about the early 1990s. It was just at the tail end of John Major's government, and it was hard to believe, even at that time, that you could ever have a government that would be as sleazy and as incompetent and inept and in it for itself as that government. Yet here we are, and we've got Boris Johnson there. And this comes down to the individual things that suggest that maybe MPs are prioritising work outside the Commons instead of representing their constituents in the Commons and in the constituency. It's about the close dealings, the revolving doors between ministerial offices and lobbying and corporate interests. It's about the cosy connections and the cronyism, the crony virus, as I termed it in the House of Commons, when people who had companies that had absolutely no track record whatsoever of manufacturing anything to do with diagnostics or medical equipment were all of a sudden winning multi-million-pound contracts during the coronavirus epidemic at the start, simply based on their closeness personally or politically to ministers. So there's an awful lot that's there. There's other kinds of corruption other than financial corruption too. There's the corruption of the process that we saw round about Owen Paterson, and the way that the government brazenly tried to rig the disciplinary process there to get one of their own off. And ultimately, I think they blinked when they saw the public and press reaction to that. But I don't think we should be relying on that as any kind of constitutional safeguard here. Basically, we've got a government that thinks that 80-seat majority makes it untouchable. They can argue that up is down, black is white, and forward is backwards, and nobody's going to contradict them. But I think this is cutting through now with people. And the danger for the government is, and I hope it comes to pass, that they really do seem to think that they can get away with anything. But the last week has shown that they can't get away with it. But if they can get away with something, they will. But, I think now there's a whole lot of hairs running. You can see the Tory press turning against Boris Johnson in real time. The Daily Mail's been out for his blood all week. Even the Daily Express is getting in the act there. He was the clown prince that got them through Brexit. Now that Brexit is kind of more or less done, if you forget about Northern Ireland, which obviously we can't do. But, now that Brexit has been delivered in a legal sense for Great Britain, you can see the vultures circling. And I think there's an awful lot of, there's a tension there in the Conservative group at Westminster. There's a tension between the old guard, the ghouls and the gargoyles who will defend any misdeed by one of their own, so long as it is one of their own that's done it. And then there's the new guard that have come in the red wall seats from England in 2019 who know that their own voters are looking askance at this, the people who put them into office in the first place, and who know that they won't survive another election if this mud starts to stick. Well, it is sticking. And I think there's a whole range of things, from corruption in public appointments, like the way they're trying to fix the appointment of Paul Dackert as the chair of the Ofcom regulator, right the way through to peerages and honours and places in the House of Lords. There's a whole rotten edifice there that's ready to come crashing down. And, I look forward to having a ringside seat at Westminster when it does.
Absolutely, and we'll come back to Paul Dacre later on in the programme, Richard. But one thing you said there, it struck me that somebody else in the Tory government who seems to think that he can get away with it is the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, who this morning accused your colleagues Drew Hendry MP and David Linden MP of getting hammered on an official flight to Gibraltar recently. Now, they've both categorically denied that, and just as we came on air, the SNP issued a statement saying Ben Wallace must apologise for abusing his role as UK Defence Secretary to attack other parties ahead of Armistice Day. There is no excuse for Tory ministers dragging our armed forces into silly political point scoring on an occasion when we must all stand united. In a botched attempt to divert media attention from the Tory sleaze scandal, Mr Wallace has only raised further questions about the behaviour of his own Tory MPs. This bungling boomerang attack has left Mr Wallace with egg all over his face and serious questions to answer about his judgment. So, Richard, this element of the story has been breaking today, but what's your view on this latest apparent attempt at deflection by a Tory minister?
I think it's pretty despicable, to be honest. I mean, you know, I know Drew and David well, and I respect them as friends and colleagues. And you know, if I believe their version of events here. What is utterly despicable is the fact that somebody would try and make some political capital out of making an accusation that they know can, you know, eventually descends into a round of he said, she said. That's very, very difficult to either prove or disprove either way, but knowing that your friends in the tabloid press will print it, you know, it's a bit like saying, you know, I know it's not true, but I just want to hear them be forced to deny it. But that would be bad enough at any time of year, but to do it around the time of Armistice Day, particularly when it's on a matter relating to the Armed Forces all-party group, which is designed to build and forge links between parliamentarians and the armed forces, is utterly reprehensible. And the only conclusion I can draw is that this is how desperate they're now getting. That the Tories are now, the word that's gone out to parliamentary private secretaries and no doubt to staffers as well, that, you know, any dirt that you can get on the SNP or Labour or the Liberal Democrats or anyone who's currently, you know, on our tail about our own standards in public life, you know, let's just try and find something, anything to throw at them, because they want to try and create the impression that we're all the same, and we're not all the same. But the only people who gain from that mindset and that weariness are the Conservatives themselves. And when there are so many questions to ask about the probity of the governing party and the individuals associated with it, as I say, when it comes to public appointment, when it comes to ministerial overriding of local planning decisions, or ministers taking decisions on planning matters, when it comes to public procurement, when it comes to elevations to the second chamber and honours and who gets to buy their place in the legislature, you know, let's not be thrown off the scent by them throwing some aniseed around here. Everyone likes a story about MPs not behaving well. In this case, I think it's entirely fabricated. And, you know, we can see the motive and the opportunity and the means that the Tories have to try and throw people off the scent here. Let's not be distracted by, you know, something that, you know, didn't happen. You know, I can understand the SNP's outrage and my own outrage at the fact that they've chosen to do it about this subject so close to Armistice Day and Remembrance Sunday. But this is just a completely diversionary tactic, you know. Let's keep our eyes on the prize and let's make sure that we muck out the stables.
Well, that's also a very good point that you make, Richard, because there's some polling today that suggests that people are keeping their eyes on the prize, as you put it. After Johnson slightly oddly told the COP conference that Britain is not a corrupt country, YouGov polling has found that 80% of people across Great Britain think that corruption is either fairly 40% or very 40% present in UK politics. And only 1% of those polled think that there's no corruption at all. And in Scotland, an even higher number of people, 82%, said that there is a lot or a fair amount of corruption in UK politics. Now, what does this polling from today, what does it suggest to you?
It suggests, sadly, that trust is low, and I think that as much as I think the Tories deserve to have this label pinned on them, or you know, a number of elected Tories do, not everybody does, and I think there's a danger that it does switch people off. It turns people off and turns them away at a time that we need people to be engaged for all sorts of reasons about how we build the recovery, about Scotland's democratic future. We need people to be properly engaged in politics and willing to put their cross in the box that they think can do the most good for that. So, on one level, it's good that people can see what's happening, but we need to make sure that people can see just as clearly who to praise and who to blame in this, and that we don't all end up getting tarred with the same brush, because politics is the only force that we have for resolving disputes peacefully, for allocating resources that are scarce, and for settling the way that we need to go forward. So we need to have faith in our politicians, or the politicians that deserve to have faith placed in them. We need to have faith in our processes, but that means it's all the more important that the rest of us hold the government to account and point the finger at what it needs pointed at here, because we need to there is a corruption, not just a corruption in terms of people seeking personal gain. That's as old as time, but it's when you see things like the corruption of the processes, like rewriting the rules for the Standards Committee's reports and how they would be disposed of round about Owen Paterson and things like that, or the Paul Dacre, as was said earlier. That is in the process to try and gerrymander him into being chair of Ofcom, so that the Tory government can then exert even more control than they already do over the broadcast and print media and the rest of it. That's the sort of things that need to be stamped out and dealt with robustly, and that's people really do need to keep their eyes on the prize here. If you want a politics that you can trust, it means having to trust politicians, and that means the trustworthy politicians having to do our best to root out the examples of where others are not showing themselves as not being deserving of that.
Absolutely, Richard. And one final question on this topic before we move on. Notoriously, the Prime Minister kept working as Mayor of London while he was first elected as an MP. And as I understand it, you, on the other hand, stood down as a councillor pretty quickly once you were elected to Westminster. So what's your own view on MPs having multiple jobs generally?
I think, if I have no objection in principle to MPs having outside interests, but, you should be in no doubt you've been elected to a very privileged position that you yourself have sought on behalf of your party and on behalf of your community, and that should be your primary job. I stayed on as a councillor. I mean, I've got no objection to people holding, dual mandates in politics, because there's a world of difference, between. My ward was entirely within my seat. I represented Ellenham district, which is right at the heart of the Gordon constituency, and I held on for a few reasons. One of which was we were coming up to the budget, and I didn't think it was fair to try and hand over to a new group leader the responsibility of preparing for a council budget, when it was only, we thought, a matter of weeks away at that time. But also, the Westminster election was slap bang in the middle of December, and I didn't think anyone would take kindly to being sent out to the polls in the cold of the spring. And then, of course, COVID hit, and we couldn't have elections anyway. But I think there's a world of difference between representing a council ward within a constituency, or being a councillor, an MP, or an MSP, than being an MP and having some outside interest. Let's choose an example entirely at random, being a lawyer like Geoffrey Cox and earning 11 times your salary on the other side of the world while you're supposed to be being an active MP. I mean, that just stinks to high heaven. But there's a world of difference between the two. But what I would say is that for all the time I did the job as a councillor, I forfeited my salary, and I asked the Chief Executive at Aberdeenshire Council to make sure that any further remuneration that was due to me as a councillor from the date of my election to Westminster went into the council's charitable trust for community works. And it didn't, councillors don't get paid a lot, but any money that I was due did go into that. So the Aberdeenshire Charitable Trust is a few £1,000s to the good as a result of that limited period of overlapping. But I think, I don't have a problem with MPs in second jobs, people, especially people who've been doctors or who are going out to perform some kind of public service. But I think there's a point of principle here. If you're an MP, it's an incredibly privileged job, or an MSP for that matter. And whatever outside interests you have, they should never be dominating the time, because quite frankly, it's more than a full-time job if you're doing it as assiduously as most of us do it. And, if you're able and in a position to earn from the duties that you perform elsewhere more than you're getting in your current salary, which is already excellent, somebody's getting shortchanged, and experience suggests it's most likely to be the taxpayer, and that's just not right.
Absolutely. Thanks, Richard. Now we will move on. I think we've dealt with that story sufficiently this evening, and we'll move on because the SNP has criticised Boris Johnson's hard Brexit deal after new figures reveal the UK's economic growth slowed down between July and September this year. Figures published by the Office for National Statistics found that economic growth for the last 3 months was just 1.3%, leaving the UK economy more than 2% smaller than in the final 3 months of 2019 before the pandemic. The report also concluded that the UK is currently exporting less in trade, therefore finding itself dependent on other nations. The trade in goods deficit widened by £5.7 billion to almost £40 billion in Q3 this year, as imports of goods increased by £2.9 billion, while exports decreased by £2.8 billion. Business leaders have voiced their concern at the news, with the head of economics at the British Chambers of Commerce, Suren Thiru, admitting that the UK may only return to its pre-pandemic level next year, behind many of our international competitors. Commenting, the SNP's Europe spokesperson Dr Philippa Whitford MP said, Boris Johnson's botched Brexit deal continues to be an unmitigated disaster for Scotland. These latest statistics highlight that the UK, post-Brexit, is a far less dynamic nation on the world stage, and that we are now exporting much less than if we were still a member of the European Union. So, Richard, Scotland is the only nation in the UK which is a net exporter. And so are these latest numbers today another example, do you think, of Scotland's interests being overridden?
Yes. I think, one of the reasons I support independence, one of the many reasons, is because I think it would allow us to better orientate ourselves towards what our natural comparative advantages would be, and that would be hindered only in that by the limits of our own abilities, the limits of our own willingness to legislate, the limits of our own resources, and the limits of our own imagination, and by nobody else's limits being imposed upon us. But there was always, post-pandemic, there was always going to be a big economic bounce back as the economy returned to some kind of trend growth. And we've seen that in previous months with some fairly significant growth rates of above 5% UK-wide. But all that's doing is kind of taking us back to a growth trend that was already pretty sluggish before COVID had hit. And of course, we've now got the self-inflicted wound of Brexit laying on top of that. That's causing a supply crisis where we don't have enough people working in key sectors. We're all familiar with the problems caused by a shortage of lorry drivers, and we're seeing that crunch in supply and the spiking of energy. And so, quite frankly, we're seeing inflationary pressures escaping into the economy in a way that we haven't seen for quite some time. We're seeing the government distracted from its day job, ironically, given that so frequently lectures the Scottish government about the need to get on with the day job. We have a Westminster government that seems to be in perpetual crisis mode. And all of that is contributing to create problems that needn't be there. But it also means it's less able to react effectively to events, and it lurches from mini crisis to mini crisis to mini crisis. And you create that, and it means it's less able to deal with the sort of the occasional black swan events, as they're sometimes termed, that come along. So, yeah, I think that there's a number of problems that the UK economy is facing, and some of them are self-inflicted and arise directly from Brexit. But the worry is that we've seen the big bounce back in growth. It still hasn't taken us back to where we were. And let's not forget that even where we were was pretty sluggish and unimpressive. So there's a range of things that need to happen. In Scotland's case, I think the biggest kick in the right direction we could give ourselves is independence, because we marry policy to resources and the ability to take decisions quickly for ourselves. We're a small country. Everybody knows everybody else in terms of politics and business, and that can make it very, very easy to make things to happen and reorientate the economy in the way that we would want. I think there's a tremendous element of growth, or at least you're effectively taking a handbrake off that's been on for since time immemorial on us, in regard to how quickly you can take decisions. But also, whether we're independent or not, we need to reverse the way that we lag behind in research and development funding. Scotland does pretty well with our universities, but we're still miles behind London and the South East, which tends to hoover up most of the R&D spend and investment. But the OECD average is 2.2% of GDP gets spent in R&D. The UK's behind that. Even with Rishi, well behind that at 1.9, I think even Rishi Sunak's budget isn't going to take the promised uplift in R&D spend isn't going to take us beyond the average. Germany, for example, was at 3.2% of GDP spent in research and development, and ultimately we need to start doing things to tackle our productivity. Now that can be things like physical infrastructure, digital infrastructure, but ultimately it's about harnessing the talents of our people properly. A more efficient political system through independence could be a tremendous boost to that, as I say, but the R&D is another biggie, and that's the one that we're really going to have to start to tackle. But also, let's stop making silly mistakes like Brexit. Let's get back to the single market, the customs union, at least in Scotland's context at any rate, because that is a self-inflicted wound that is going to be costing us for decades to come in terms of making it much, much harder to get the same kind of outputs that we were able to get before through the seamless trade with a continent of 600 million consumers.
Of course, Richard, thank you. Now, we'll very quickly touch again on somebody who you mentioned earlier on, Paul Dacre, because concerns have been raised today about the composition of the panel, which will decide the new chair of the media regulator, Ofcom. The former Tory advisor, Michael Simmons, who's the husband of the schools minister, Nick Gibb, and the brother-in-law, therefore, of BBC board member and former Number 10 communications chief, Robbie Gibb, will now sit on the interview panel, which will decide which applicants meet the required criteria to head the organisation. He'll join lobbyist Michael Prescott, who's a senior executive at Hanover Communications, a company with close connections to the Conservative Party. It's believed that Downing Street is determined to offer the job to former Daily Mail editor Paul Dacre, so much so that ministers are now rerunning the process to give Mr Dacre a second chance after he apparently failed in his first interview. The UK government currently finds itself under intense scrutiny following an investigation by the Sunday Times and Open Democracy, which found that all 16 of the main Tory treasurers over the past 20 years have been handed peerages after donating millions of pounds to the party. Commenting, the SNP's Shadow Culture and Media Secretary John Nicholson MP said, Ofcom plays a huge and important role as a media regulator. The new online safety bill will give it significant powers. However, it needs to have teeth, it needs to be independent, and it needs to be seen to be independent. Ministers seem determined, however, to parachute their preferred candidate, Paul Dacre, into a job few think that he's qualified for. He failed in his first interview, and now Downing Street is changing the job description and packing the interview panel. So, Richard, we touched on it a little before, but briefly, what do you think, in the circumstances that Downing Street gets its apparent way and Paul Dacre becomes the chair of Ofcom, what do you think the effect will be of having him as the chair of the main UK media regulator?
Well, I try to think. I can remember the absolutely obnoxious way in which the obnoxious output from the Daily Mail under his stewardship when he was the editor, and the way that minority groups were stigmatised, and the way that he relentlessly cheerleaded for one political party in particular, and one political wing of one political party in particular. Now, you might say that that's the mark of a populist right-wing tabloid editor, and he did what it said in the tin. But all the qualities that maybe made him a successful tabloid editor for a right-wing tabloid, as much as it chafes with my own sensibilities, render him completely unsuited to any kind of role that requires impartiality and objectivity when it comes to dealing with broadcast media, the new electronic media, press and communications more generally. So he's completely unsuited, and they should find somebody else. I'm sure they've got plenty of other donors that they could favour if they really looked hard. But we're just back to the same crap that we had with Owen Patterson, aren't we? There's something coming down the line, they don't particularly like it, so let's rig the committee to get the outcome that we want. And it goes back to exactly what I said earlier, that there is nothing that they won't do if they think they can get away with it. And clearly, they still think that this is something that they can get away with. And once if he is ensconced, once he starts, running the regulator the way that he and presumably his Tory masters think it should be run, then you start to skew the landscape. You start to move that Overton window that they sometimes speak of in politics. You start to normalise that which is not currently mainstream. And again, it just ratchets the UK that further to the right, with all that entails. So, let's not be under any illusions that he's there because of any good he can bring, any particularly positive qualities he can bring to the job, or any good. But he's simply there because he's seen to be biddable and compliant, or will go out and do the job that the ideologues in the Conservative Party think that needs to be done, as they try to move fast and break things and reshape the UK in the image that they think it should be shaped. But it's part of the corruption of the process. There's maybe no financial corruption going on here, but there's certainly a corruption of process going on that should not be stood for. Nobody should be putting up with that. But I think I'm reminded of something that my mum once told me about people when I was growing up learning music, and that you should always be careful about what you say about people, because everybody knows everybody else. But she didn't put it quite as politely as that. The way she put it was, you kick one's arse and they all rattle. And the older I get, and especially since being down in Westminster as an MP, you start to see how the establishment all hangs together, and how the donors are linked to dinner party circuits and appointments and all the rest of it, and how everybody in that set of circles knows everybody else. And
Right.
they can't see anything wrong with a friend getting something like that. I think, look at this from outside as we do from Scotland, and you can see exactly what's wrong with it. To be fair, an awful lot of people in London, in the London scene as well, political scene, can see what's wrong with it as well. But it is a corruption of the process, because the Tories think they can get away with it. And, I think that the responsibility falls on a lot of people to make sure that this is something else that they don't get away with, because the costs of going ahead become too hot for them.
Of course. Thanks, Richard. Now then, we'll pivot now, and we'll move away from UK politics particularly, and we'll start discussing a number of the headlines from the COP26 conference, which is well and truly into its second week in Glasgow. And so firstly, a surprise deal between China and the United States, they're the world's two biggest greenhouse gas emitters, has boosted the COP26 climate summit as it enters two final days of tough bargaining to try to stop global warming becoming catastrophic. Conference President Alex Sharma told delegations that the latest draft conclusions that he had seen showed significant progress, but that we are not there yet, he said. In particular, he called for more effort on climate finance, the perennially vexed question of how much the rich countries whose development caused most global warming should pay the poorer ones who will bear most of its consequences. Developing nations want tougher rules from 2025 onwards, after rich countries failed to meet a 2009 pledge to provide $100 billion a year in climate finance by 2020 to help them curb emissions and cope with the effects of rising temperatures. Campaigners say that sum is anyway woefully inadequate. China, the world's biggest producer of greenhouse gases, has gradually accepted more responsibility for its emissions from an economy that has grown beyond measure in the last 2 decades. The US climate envoy John Kerry and his Chinese counterpart Xi Zhenhua unveiled a joint declaration late on Wednesday in which China, the biggest producer and user of coal, promised to accelerate its transition from the dirtiest fossil fuel. This deal between two global powers, which have been divided by many diplomatic disputes on other issues, sent a powerful message to COP26, including the producers of the fossil fuels that are the main cause of man-made global warming. So, Richard, just how powerful a message do you think it is that this agreement between China and the US sends?
I think it gives me grounds for hope. I mean, we'd obviously hope that it's unfortunate that China didn't send a high-level political delegation to COP26, and neither did Russia. But it just shows what is possible. And I think one of the reasons I am a multilateralist is because I've never believed that one country, however big, however powerful, acting on its own was ever going to be enough for the world. And so getting the world's major economies, the world's biggest polluters in China and the US, to act in some kind of consort here so that neither is seen as getting an advantage over the other in terms of, moving away from traditional means of manufactured and energy production, I think is a good thing for us, however much I wish they might have done it earlier and with more ambition. So, I mean, I didn't start out COP26, I have to say, with a huge amount of hope. You know, it was the last big hope for the planet, but I had no huge expectations of it. But slowly, surely, I think we're starting to see details of the deals emerging. There'll be a few more rabbits to pull out of hats. Obviously, I think we'll be disappointed that it hasn't done everything that we might have hoped. But I think that if the promises are made good, we're going to be heading towards a much better set of outcomes for the planet than would otherwise have been the case, albeit we're still in for a rocky ride on the climate. But given, as I say, the inauspicious way it started, in which the summit started with, major political leadership absent from China and Russia, to get news of this Sino-American agreement today, which will particularly help which commits China to moving away from using the particularly polluting form of coal that they do in order to meet their needs, it can only be seen as a positive and to be welcomed.
Thanks, Richard. Now, as part of the COP26 conference, we've been to speak to Ross Greer, the West of Scotland Green MSP, and also Gillian Mackay, who's the the Green MSP for Central Scotland. And so here are those two interviews now.
I'm Ross Greer, Green MSP for the West of Scotland, and I'm in Glasgow here at the Global Green Party Hub because the Scottish Greens are hosting our whole political family across the globe here at COP26. Yeah, we're hosting an event today on what the experience is of young people who've been elected to Parliament. Greens believe really passionately that whether it's parliaments or local councils or any other elected body, it should look like the society it's supposed to represent. And it can't do that unless there are people from every age range in the room. And we know that parliaments, all elected bodies, politics in general, skews massively towards older people, and there are very few young people in most parliaments. In fact, all parliaments across the world lack young people. So what we've got today is a discussion event between two Scottish Green MSPs, both of us who were elected under the age of 30, one of our colleagues from the Australian Senate and one of our colleagues from the Rwandan Parliament, to share and compare our experiences of often, regularly being the youngest person in the room when we're at work.
I think at the moment parliaments don't look like the communities they represent. We've made great strides in the Scottish Parliament. There are more young people, there are more women, there are more disabled people than ever before in the Scottish Parliament. But it's still not representative of the Scotland that we live in. And I think that's key to engaging more young people, to listen to their voices and to amplify their voices in everything that we're doing. Because if we don't listen to them, if we don't engage, if we don't amplify those voices, then the next generation of people coming into elected office like Ross and myself are going to be only those who have been able to engage through parental support, through being privileged in other ways. And actually it's those young people that are not currently engaged in politics, that are not currently engaged in decisions being made on their behalf and in their communities, that we need to get involved with and make sure that their voices are heard too.
I think all you need to do is look at whether it's the UK government or plenty of other governments across the world and see that age certainly doesn't bring experience, or it certainly doesn't lead you to making the right decisions. As I said, if parliaments don't look like the society they represent, they're not going to be able to make informed decisions about how to best govern that society. So we know there are massive generational differences, for example, in areas like housing, or whether it's attitudes on social issues like LGBT rights, or on the climate itself. There's a huge gulf in both the experience of different generations, but also their outlook, that people's vision for the future. If you're saying, you can't actually really be doing this until you're over 40, until you've gone and done something else first, then you are excluding an entire generation of people. And particularly to do that now with the climate in crisis, to exclude young people from Parliament when it's young people who've driven the movement for effective climate action, that would be profoundly unjust to the generation who are trying to undo the damage caused by the failures of everyone who has spent the last few decades in our parliaments and our governments across the world.
Today, COP26 is focusing on regions and cities and the built environment. What area of that topic do the Scottish Greens want to focus on, and where do you think the most challenge is from a Green perspective?
I think making sure that buildings are energy efficient, that we can lift communities out of fuel poverty and alleviate some of that pressure on family budgets at the moment is really important. Some of the difficulty in that is some of our older buildings and some of our community buildings that are maybe needing more work than some of the others. I think also making sure that the buildings that we are putting up are as both carbon neutral and energy efficient as possible is really important. On the cities and regions, making sure that decision making is made at the most local level possible. And actually a lot of the things that we could do better, we could do with independence, and making sure that we make our own decisions, both at a Scottish Parliament level and at a local authority level, as close to the people of Scotland as we can.
Green politics is founded on 4 key pillars, and one of those pillars is grassroots or radical democracy. So for us, it's the idea that decisions are taken best as close to the people they affect as possible, or preferably by those people. So today's theme at COP is about sub-national governments, so cities and regions. That to us is incredibly important because that's a level of decision making much closer to communities. And we know that decentralisation, handing power back to people, regularly results in better decisions being made, because when power is centralised, when it's far away from the public, it's much easier for vested interests, it's much easier for the rich and powerful to have a stranglehold over the decisions that are made. So Greens are really passionate about local levels of government and empowering communities to make decisions about themselves. The other half of today's theme at COP is around the built environment, and for us here in Scotland, that's a huge part of the Green agenda, because one of our 2 Green ministers who've just joined the government, Patrick Harvey, is the Minister for Zero Carbon Buildings. Part of Patrick's job is figuring out how we're going to spend about £1.8 billion over the next 5 years to make buildings across Scotland as energy efficient as possible. And that means creating tens of thousands of jobs in the energy efficiency sector and doing things like installing better insulation, heat pumps, etc. But it's also about lifting families out of fuel poverty, because we know that climate justice and economic and social justice come hand in hand. So there's a massive opportunity for us to do that through the built environment agenda, because we know that, yes, we absolutely need to switch to renewable sources of energy, but what's absolutely key for us here in Scotland is simply reducing the amount of energy that we consume, and we will do that by making our buildings, whether it's housing, whether it's public buildings, even private buildings, as energy efficient as we possibly can.
And there we are. Great to hear from Ross Greer and Gillian Mackay, and thanks also to Amber and the team for producing that package for us. But we'll move on to the next story now, and that is that the way in which marine and coastal habitats such as salt marshes and seagrass store carbon is to be explored and tested through a new Scottish-led initiative to help tackle the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. The Blue Carbon International Policy Challenge will make awards of £10,000 available for up to 5 successful projects that can demonstrate how they will establish policy blueprints for domestic and international action after COP26. The challenge seeks to bring together private, public and third sector organisations from across the globe to increase our knowledge of blue carbon and identify how to move from research to action. The Rural Affairs Secretary, Mary Goodgen, announced the challenge at the Blue Carbon Conference in Edinburgh, run by the Scottish Blue Carbon Forum in partnership with the University of St Andrews and the Scottish Government. She said, "There is an increasing recognition across the international community of the role of the carbon stored in our seas and ocean for enhancing action on climate change, mitigation, adaptation and resilience. Scotland is already playing a leading role in research on blue carbon, given the size of our seas, our commitment to marine conservation, and our well-established work on blue carbon, as well as our decisive action to address climate change. I am keen that that continues. We must move as fast as we can from research into testing and taking action." So, Richard, this sounds like another example of the Scottish Government trying to lead by example. Do you think are other devolved administrations and other governments more generally doing enough to drive innovation, research and development, we were talking about before, to drive research and development forward?
I honestly couldn't answer for other devolved administrations, but what I would say is something I've said before, that when it comes to global influence, particularly on the climate, it's not the examples of your power that matters so much as the power of your example. And I think Scotland is well respected and renowned internationally for the quality of our academic research, for the quality of our environment, for the way that we've led on climate change within those matters that are within our power. And I think that while we can obviously look to technical solutions to try and reduce our climate impact, whether that's in terms of the way we produce renewable energy or in terms of how we reduce energy output, energy demand through, improved insulation, greater efficiency of processes, all the rest of it. Our greatest friend in tackling climate change is always going to be the planet itself, and in terms of what we can do to help the planet help us to recover. Now, obviously, deforestation has a massive role to play in that. They've been talking about that at COP earlier in the summit. But we know ourselves from our traditional, from the flow country and our traditional peatlands, and how much carbon is actually sequestrated in there, and how harmful it is to remove that, particularly to use as a source of fuel. So, the restoration of peatland has a massive role to play in terms of, or a significant role to play in terms of tackling climate change. But in terms of other forms of vegetation in the marine environment, I think for me, that's not something I'm quite so familiar with. But, we have a massive coastline, we have a wealth of marine life existing around our shores. And if there are things that we can do to help nature take its course in that regard, in terms of how the marine environment can help us to naturally tackle the amount of carbon dioxide that is there, and to combat global warming in the process, then I think it's important that we should understand that, because there's an awful lot of unintended consequences when it comes to trying to tackle climate change, and an awful lot of intricate, linked, moving parts, and actions don't always have equal opposite reactions in that. So if there are things that we can do with our own marine environment which can help to fight climate change, but more importantly, which have a read across to other coastal areas wherever they are in the world, then that's a lesson that's worth learning, and worth learning quickly, because we're going to need all the tools in our armoury that we can have if we're going to keep the growth in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees or less.
Absolutely. Thanks, Richard. Now, the First Minister has confirmed that the Scottish Government will increase its fund for climate justice by a further 50%, on top of the previous commitment to double the fund as part of Scotland's response and contribution to the ongoing negotiations at COP26. Calling on larger countries with more resources to recognise their moral responsibility and to adopt a can-do attitude for the final days of COP26 to secure a successful outcome, the First Minister said, "It is clear that fair climate finance is the key to making real progress at COP26. Every vulnerable or developing country I have spoken with has big ambitions for meeting the climate crisis, but they do not have the funding for adaptation, for mitigation, or for tackling the loss and damage that is needed to deliver. 12 years on from the commitment by developed nations to provide funding of $100 billion a year, that is simply not good enough. It is time for leaders in developed countries, large and small, to do what is needed to bridge the remaining gap and put on the table now the money that is needed to make good on past commitments and unlock progress in other areas." The Scottish Government, which had already committed to doubling their Climate Justice Fund to £24 million in this Parliament, has now decided to increase it by a further £12 million. This means that since the fund was opened in 2012 by the Scottish Government, it will have trebled. So, Richard, the First Minister made a number of points regarding climate finance. Now, we've heard about the Glasgow Finance Agreement for Net Zero, GFAN, and the way in which financial institutions are turning towards investment and business practices which will help to decarbonise our economies. So do you sense that large institutions, for example, like the one that you used to work for, are becoming sufficiently serious about the climate crisis and about the role they have to play?
That's a very difficult question. I think any institution that's investing large amounts of money, and pension funds are amongst the largest pots of money that we have, should be mindful of changing viewpoints in terms of where their investors, like you and me, want to see our money invested. But they also have to be mindful from a financial point of view of the financial costs of climate change, particularly rising sea levels and the damage that can come from changing weather. So arguably, even if you weren't even if you weren't particularly concerned about climate change in and of itself, if you're an investor, you ought to be very concerned about the impact it has on those investments that you look after, for the impacts that climate change goes on to have. So I think there's a certain element of amoral but still enlightened self-interest at work there. But I think there's a huge ethical dimension to this, and I think that wise and enlightened financial institutions will want to be in the front foot with this, and will want to be seen to be in the front foot with this, and will want to create the opportunities for investment that for people that are in line with their ethics and their goals, and which make a positive rather than a negative contribution to the climate. But I think in terms of what the Scottish Government has announced, £12 million, it's a reasonably significant sum of money, especially as it represents overall a trebling of the Scottish Government's commitment. And I think it just shows that this isn't just about international state level operators having a role at COP or in the wider world. It's about all of us having a role, and I see it's already starting to annoy all the right people. I see that Stephen Kerr MSP's already spat the dummy out about this, which makes you think, that's always a good sign. It's like the cold wet nose in a Labrador when Stephen Kerr's raging about something. You're probably on the side of the angels. But there's also, I think, a particularly strong moral argument for Scotland in terms of tackling climate change. We were arguably the first country on earth to industrialise, because of the proximity of our coal to our iron ore, and understanding the interplay between them and making steel, and then using that to manufacture. And we went on to set an example that much of the rest of the world followed in terms of that industrialisation of heavy industry and manufacturing. Now, we didn't know what example we were setting in terms of the climate at that time, quite obviously, but the industrial revolution as we know it really started in many ways in central Scotland. And, so it's only right that, it's central Scotland with COP26 in Glasgow where we're setting a new course for the world, and that it's a government for Scotland that is doing its bit and leading the way and stepping into areas where it has no direct political responsibility, but it feels it has a moral obligation to go in and assist and set an example. But again, there's an awful lot of funds under management in Scotland and financial institutions, to go back to the start of your question, Andrew. And I think that we've also got a lot of funds under management through the local government pension schemes. And I think that there's an awful lot that we could do to make sure that the power of that resource is used for good. Not just for the provision of the benefits that we'll all need in later life when it comes to paying for our upkeep, but in the mean can ensure that those monies are put to a socially responsible use, which, yes, generates a sustainable level of growth for us, but also has a positive rather than a negative environmental impact. And there's many, many ways, I'm sure, in which that can be done.
Absolutely. Thanks, Richard. And for our final story this evening, Scotland has committed to honour the rights of children in the fight against the climate crisis by signing the UNICEF Declaration on Children, Youth and Climate Action. The declaration, which was drafted by children and young people, calls on signatories to uphold the priorities of children and youth throughout the world in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Signatories commit to advocating for children's inalienable right to a healthy environment and to enhancing the meaningful participation of children and young people in climate change discussions and action. Scotland recently hosted the UN Conference of Youth ahead of COP26 and has invested almost £1 million in a programme to engage young people in the climate conference and legacy activity. The First Minister formally signed the declaration during COP26, and the launch event is being attended by the Minister for Green Skills, Circular Economy and Lorna Slater, and Scotland becomes the 28th country to have signed up so far. The First Minister said, "Children and young people are driving climate action, and it is vital that we listen to their views and harness their passion at COP26 and beyond." Now, we've seen and we've heard a great deal from young people as part of COP26, Richard, and I'm mindful that you have a young family yourself. So has COP26 or the current climate crisis, has that been a topic of discussion over the dinner table?
It has. My eldest has been taking a particular interest in it, and wanting to know what's been happening. And I get the cop, and I get the feeling that she's actually in a better position to inform me some days than I am. When I've been busy attending to other things. Actually, I was involved in a program on another broadcaster, less prestigious than Broadcasting Scotland last week. I was let loose in the BBC and on their Politics Live programme, and we were having a discussion about the use of plastics. And unusually for something that our daddy had been on, or their daddy had been on, both girls were absolutely wrapped in attention at this debate about plastic, because it's something that they can relate directly to something else that they care about. So yes, I think it's something that is taught in schools. I think it's something that young people have a great interest in, and not just because it's about the planet that they one day will inherit. But I think that the declaration that was signed today, I think about it's really, really important. It's a really, really important step, and advocating for global recognition and fulfilment of children's inalienable right to a healthy environment, enhancing efforts to respect, promote, and consider the rights of children and young people, and implementing the Paris Agreement. Looking at the measures that are involved in disaster risk reduction and mitigation, strengthening the capacity of children and young people in climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts, and just generally involving young people in the scale of the debate at as early and age-appropriate level as possible, and giving them a say in the process so that they're ready to step up to the responsibilities when, at the appropriate time in adulthood, but also living as responsible citizens now and adopting those values. I think that's a really important thing to have done. It's a real declaration of intent, and I now look forward to seeing that. Let's see how we, having signed the broad brush pledges, let's actually, now that we've talked the talk, let's walk the walk as well in terms of how we implement that through the curriculum for excellence, because it's doing a good job at the moment. I can see that with my own two bairns, but let's just make sure that we are our next cohort of global citizens that we're producing here from Scotland are ready to demonstrate that, as I said before, that power of our example, and make sure that we're letting loose, if you like, at the end of their school careers into the adult world, a cohort of citizens that are ready to face up to all of their responsibilities as local and global citizens.
Absolutely. Thanks, Richard. And that was our final news item this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland, and you will find the link to do that on the screen now. Supporting Broadcasting Scotland is one way to make sure that we are able to bring an independent media in Scotland to life in the way that we've seen, for example, with our colleagues working at COP26 from Bosnian N1. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. So I'd like to say thanks to Richard Thomson MP for joining us on the programme, and of course thanks to everyone for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland today. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you.
And that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening.